Good afternoon. Welcome to Election Watch. I'm John Fortier at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm here with my co-host, Chris Stirewalt, also of AEI. You are here at Election Watch, which is the longest running election series in Washington. It began in 1982 with our colleagues, Carlin Bowman and Norm Ornstein, who still join us on occasion, some of our panels, and we've been running ever since. A few things. I'm gonna introduce the panel. I'll give you a few little logistics, and then I'll throw it to Chris to kind of go down the line. First, of course, this is a series, Election Watch, so we will have our next Election Watch on October 30th. And then, as always, we will have a post-election Election Watch. This time, a little different, not 2 days after, but the night after. So look for that. But October 30th is the next one. And then, again, we'll have time for your questions as well. And I might as well put this out here for the audience, but also for those watching online or on C-SPAN. If you want to have a question, you can email Nate Moore, nate.moore, M-O-O-R-E, at AEI.org, or you can use the hashtag ElectionWatchAEI. So I'm going to begin. We've got a great panel, and we've got I'll begin by introducing Bill McInturff, who is sitting next to me, who's joined us in 2002 for the Election Watch series. He's a partner and co-founder of Public Opinion Strategies. He conducts the NBC News polls with the Hart Research Associates, and in 2008 was the lead pollster for John McCain's presidential campaign. Michael Potterzer is the board chair for the Analyst Institute, former political director at the AFL-CIO, co-chairs Catalyst, and is also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. That was Michael. This is Amy. And in the middle, Amy Walter is the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. She's also a contributor to the PBS NewsHour, regular panelist on NBC's Meet the Press and CNN's Inside Politics, and is a former political director of ABC News. With that, I will throw it to Chris to begin.
Okay, I want you people to know how extraordinarily lucky you are, not just because of the chicken thighs, which smell very good. I can say that I'm extraordinarily sorry that I skipped lunch because it's looking very good and you all look, and I like the slight laze and sheen that a good filling lunch has put on you, so you'll be a docile crowd. I like that. I like that about you. You're also very lucky that the American Enterprise Institute exists as a place where people like these three people will come and have frank conversations. We have a real Republican, we have a real Democrat, we have a real impartial analyst, a journalist of the highest water. I know how good Amy is because I steal her stuff about half the time. About half the stuff that I say I'm actually just stealing from Amy. And these two gentlemen are the real deal. So we're very lucky to have them, so I'm grateful. We're each going to start out, take a little bite out of this elephant, and talk about what's going on. And I'm going to talk about first the Sunbelt, right? So there are 7 swing states in this presidential election. And we've got the Rust Belt, the Northern Tier, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is the mother of all swing states. It has 19 electoral votes, and it's right in the middle. It falls right about in the middle of those. It's third or fourth in the partisanship of those 7 states. It's the big one. The southern states, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina. Here's your rough guide for watching the election. Any of those southern states other than Nevada, which I will complain about Nevada at length at another time. Any of those 3 southern states that goes blue, Kamala Harris is going to win the election. Any of those northern states that go red, Donald Trump is probably going to win the election because they move in a direction. So what's the direction that the southern states are going? So of the 4 southern states, Nevada is the most Democratic. Of those 7 swing states, it's been the most Democratic one in every election since 2008. And it has this astonishing thing that it likes to do to us every 2 to 4 years. The polls are so close. The Republicans are playing in Nevada. It's going to be big in Nevada. And then Nevada goes, no, actually, we're quite a Democratic state. We're actually quite Democratic. They have good turnout on the ground because of service worker unions and a bunch of other things. But they, along with Michigan, have been the most consistently Democratic swing state. How does it stand currently? that Kamala Harris enjoys, in an average of polls, 0.8 of a point. Not very much. Not very much at all, especially in states that both Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden won by 2.4 points. So that's pretty close. But the race is young. Who knows what that will be? We don't have a ton of swing state polling. Okay, so now we're going to go east. We'll go to Arizona. And that's a state that Trump won by 3.5 points. Joe Biden won by 0.3 of a point. 11,400 votes, but who was counting? I don't even know if I can remember the number. And currently, polling in that state has Trump up by 0.5 point. Not very much. That's very close. That is not where you'd like to be in a state that was traditionally Republican if you're a Republican. Now we go east to Georgia. That was Trump by 5.2 points in 2016. That was Biden by 0.2 of a point in 2020. That close. Kamala Harris is leading by 1.1 points. North Carolina, that was Trump by 3.7 points in 2016, Trump to 1.3 points in 2020. And in 2024, at this point, average of polls puts Trump up by 0.3 of a point. Not enough if you're a Republican. What do those eastern states have in common? They have substantial African American populations. And they also have a substantial number of college-educated suburbanites. And when we look at really Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina, but particularly Georgia and North Carolina, the hope for Democrats is that they can put together a coalition that includes high turnout, maybe Obama levels of turnout for black voters, but keep the affluent, educated suburbanites in the collar counties of Atlanta and of Charlotte and of Raleigh. If they can do that, then they'll win both of those states. How do Republicans win those states? Is every place else that's not those places turns out like gangbusters, right? In the small towns and rural areas of those states, that they continue to spike those numbers that Trump has seen before. So that is the lay of the land when it comes to down south. Now let's go down the line and wow us, dazzle us with the brilliance on the matter that you have been asked to prepare on.
Which you've raised the bar on because you've put them all in a glaze. So you have to adjust for that. So I want to take you back to a moment that looking around will either be, you'll look back and it'll be kind of triggering or you'll feel wistful, which is November 2016, right after the election, right? And if we were sitting here in this room talking about what happened and what we would expect, right, we would all either, I'm not going to keep going back and forth that you have different emotions, but we'd all be thinking, for good or ill, oh my God, these 3 blue wall impenetrable states just flipped. And we know that it was because white non-college voters have been abandoning the Democratic Party, and the future is red, right? Since then, there have been 27 statewide elections in the 5 states that determine American politics. The Blue Wall, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia, right? At that point, the governors of those states were almost all Republicans. The state legislatures were Republicans. I think 6 of the senators, 10 senators were Republicans, right? 27 statewide elections. Trump and MAGA have lost 23 of them. That future that you either thought was your birthright on November 2016 or your doom just didn't materialize. And why is that? Because from the moment he came down that escalator, a majority of Americans have not wanted him to be president and have not wanted to live in the America that he wants to create, right? That's what I call the anti-MAGA majority. And even though we've been through the worst pandemic in more than a century, we've been through the mass unemployment, we've been through 2 impeachment trials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what we knew that November evening, where the fulcrum of American politics was, that it was going to be close, and that if they show up, that majority who really doesn't want to live the MAGA future or have Donald Trump as president will prevail, right? It is boring, right? It is like, means every day you like read the story about the latest poll, you're just becoming less informed about what's coming, right? This is the reality of America right now. That it doesn't mean that Harris is necessarily going to win, right? 2016, Wisconsin, 20,000 votes for Trump. 2020, 20,000 votes for Biden, right? But the point is that what's happened, and this is something that unfortunately never gets covered because polling flattens elections into two dimensions. Are you for Harris or Trump? When it should be three, the third dimension is, are you going to actually vote? And our elections have been decided by the people who historically were never engaged in politics, but are either inspired enough by Trump to come vote, or more of them who are afraid of Trump to come vote, right? The people who thought no one was serious about doing a national, like being for abortion ban, and the ones who thought no one would ever do it, right on the other side. And there turns out there are a lot more of them, right? You look at those 5 states that I mentioned that Biden flipped. If you look at either any of the VoteCast, Edison, modeling, the people in those 5 states who showed up in 2016 and 2020 gave Biden and Clinton the exact same losing margin. The reason Biden won those states and went from Clinton's 2 points to 4.5 are all these new voters. And because that isn't part of the story you read about, it's really impossible to understand how to process all of this, right? And we can talk more about it, I don't want to take too much time, but that's the thing, right? It's like we've gone through all these historic events, we've gone through scandals, we've gone through crimes, we've gone through insurrection, and it's still the same country it was November 2016.
Like that cliffhanger, Amy. What do you got to follow up with that?
Well, should I do my assigned or
Do
should
your-
I
do
respond
your assigned
to?
work. We can
okay,
return
well,
later.
what I was, and I will be happy to come back later. My assignment was to also talk about the Senate map and the Senate polling. And one of the more remarkable things about the difference between the difference in what we're seeing in polling for the presidential in these states and the polling that we're seeing for the Senate races in those states, and people trying to understand why, even when Biden was on the top of the ticket and was in a much significantly lower position on the ballot than, in terms of the vote that they were getting, than Harris is, those Democratic Senate candidates were still ahead. How is it possible that voters could feel so frustrated about the president and the president's job approval, the state of the economy, and yet still say that they were going to support a Democratic candidate, especially, and I'm speaking specifically in those same swing states that Mike mentioned. So the Arizonas and the Wisconsin and Pennsylvanias. Montana and Ohio are a totally different category, so I'm going to just shove them over here for a second. Because I think the more interesting story for down ballot this election is whether or not we're going to see, for the first time really since 2016, an actual split ticket election, where down ballot will look different from the top of the ballot. And in 2016, not one single candidate running for the Senate who was from a state that their party's presidential nominee lost was able to win. In 2020, you had one Senate candidate who was able to do that, and that was Susan Collins in Maine, who won a state, obviously, that Donald Trump did not. So, and what's even more fascinating is when you look at how close those races were, especially in 2016, New Hampshire and Nevada, those were states that were decided by the narrowest of margins at the presidential level. So were the Senate races. They may have gotten votes from different places, the Senate candidate, if you looked at their coalition of places where they picked up support, looked different, but the overall numbers looked exactly the same. This idea that voters, even in a place where they maybe weren't supporting the top of the ticket voted similarly. So will this be the time where we actually see, because it looks like it today, that the Senate candidates are going to go in a different direction than the presidential? And I think what we're seeing, at least at this point, are a couple of advantages that Senate Democrats have. One, they're better known. Many of these are not just incumbents, but longtime incumbents. Bob Casey, Tammy Baldwin have been there for a pretty significant amount of time. But Jackie Rosen in Nevada, who's a brand new senator, also outperforming what Harris and Biden are currently polling in the state. So it's not just that they have a relationship with that state. I think it's also the fact that the Democratic voters in those states coalesced behind the Democratic candidate for Senate much more quickly than they did for Biden, and what they're starting to do for Harris. So many of those Democrats who were sitting on the fence saying, I don't know what I'm going to do about Biden, and I'm not really appreciating what he's doing. I don't really think he's doing a particularly good job. They still were supporting the Democratic candidate for the Senate. So I think that's the first thing that's happening. Democratic Senate candidates, at least most recently, are also doing a much better job, even than Harris is doing, and certainly a lot better than Biden was doing, with winning over independent voters, especially some of those swing independent voters. Some of that is due to the fact that Democrats have been outspending the Republican candidates who people don't really know very well. At the end of the day, I think these races, while they look like there is a significant difference between the margin between the Senate race and the presidential race, is ultimately going to collapse down, and that these Senate races are going to look a heck of a lot more like where we have the presidential races. So within, Mike pointed out, these states that have both competitive Senate and presidential races will both be fought within the 1 or 2 point margin. And the only question then going forward is it possible, Chris, when you pointed out, like, okay, if Pennsylvania ends up going for Trump, will Bob Casey end up winning that? And to that point, I don't know yet. I wish I could tell you where we are there, but it really comes down to, I think, watching as we get past, and this is, I hope we get into this in the Q&A, as we get past this September 10th debate. Because I think everything up until this point has been pretty much at the presidential level, reconstituting of the Democratic constituency around Harris that Biden did not enjoy. So Democrats coming home to Harris, we now have a race that is a lot closer than what we had with Biden. From September, after this debate onward, now we have a race where the candidates are going to be, or where voters are finally going to be engaged with candidates, especially one candidate who they don't know particularly well, and that's Kamala Harris. And so the ability for her to basically make her case effectively is the question for the next whatever many days, 60 days we have left. The question for Trump is whether he can undermine that. His opinions of Donald Trump aren't going to change between now and the election. Opinions of Kamala Harris can change between now and the election. And that, to me, is going to impact not just who wins the presidential election, but the kinds of people who fundamentally show up to vote in those key swing states and will have an impact on the down ballot.
But I'm not going to let you get away with not talking about Montana and Ohio. And I will just say, for everybody's context, the Democrats have written off one Senate seat already. They have written off West Virginia. Joe Manchin is not running. That's going to go. So that puts it at a 50, that's a 50-50 split. And that if the Democrats win the presidency, and every other state, this is the worst map for Democrats. Certainly, I mean,
I don't know when.
Yeah, worse than 2014, and 2014 it's on par with 2014.
Yeah.
It's a stinker.
It's
And the two toughest places for Republicans, or for Democrats, look to be Ohio
and Montana.
And isn't it true that the Republicans could basically afford to buy every Montana voter a 5-piece chicken dinner.
Yes.
And beg them, please, God, just do not let John Tester go back to the Senate, and then they win the Senate, right?
Yeah, you just need Montana.
You just
and
need
that
Montana.
and that is increasingly difficult for Democrats to hold on to. So you are correct. Montana is the ball game, with Ohio being sort of the backup. So you're right, for Republicans, the winning control of the Senate is a much easier path if you say, okay, okay, fine, you don't win Montana or Ohio. Then you have 7 other places to go to. So that is the fundamental challenge for Democrats in those, in the map overall. But I do find the battle in the swing states to be the interesting polling question. In terms of the control of the Senate, yes, it is really about Montana.
And one other quick follow-up.
Yeah.
I think you said you think it's going to close up in some of these races, partly because many Republican challengers aren't as well known.
Yeah.
We're gonna go back to more basics. But I also have the assumption, you have the assumption that Trump is going to outperform every Senate candidate. Do you think that, or is there a place that you think that a Republican Senate candidate would outperform Trump?
Would a place where they would outperform Trump? Well, don't know. Let me put it this way. I think the coalition that turns out for some of these Senate candidates could look different than the coalition that votes for Donald Trump. And we saw that in a place like Pennsylvania in 2016, where a Pat Toomey did much better in the suburbs than a Donald Trump did. And Trump did better in the rural areas than a Toomey did. But they ultimately both ended up winning. I just find it hard to believe that somebody's going to be able to do that much better or will do that much worse than their presidential candidate within 1 to 3 points.
Bill, and we gave you an assignment to talk about the Republican side. I hope you also might say something, because none of us have really talked about the change of the race since our president dropped out and our vice president is now the nominee. I hope you'll talk a little bit about that, as well as just the general state on the Republican side.
Okay, I'm a structuralist in terms of looking at what the race was like. And what the race was like was in my opinion, Donald Trump was going to be elected president against Joe Biden, and maybe by a surprising and comfortable margin. And after the debate, he was going to win by a very comfortable margin. The structural forces that made me say that about the Trump-Biden race are still in place and are still why this race is very close. But the structural forces are not good for an incumbent vice president of the Democratic Party. We measure that by, is the country in the right direction or wrong track? Wrong track during the Biden era, when Biden was there, was in the low 70s, 73%. No one has ever won a re-election with a wrong track number like that. And it's better for Harris. It's dropped to 65. But lots of people have lost the presidency with a 65% wrong track. So a lot of these numbers they were so grim for Biden, and now they are at a marginal place for Harris that's better, but they're still really strong signs. So what are the strong signs that are structural? Wrong track, still in the mid-60s. People are asked a very simple question: is the Biden administration a success or failure? 54% say it's a failure. It's been a failed administration. Then a very interesting polling, half sample. How about the Biden-Harris administration? A little better, 52% failure. But it's still a majority saying that it's a failed administration. The number one issue is inflation, the cost of living. There's a good polling question. If the vice president's elected, will prices go up or down? 22% will go down, 44% will go up. So I think her campaign's doing that, handling that as best they can. But the presumption that people are making is by about a 2-to-1 margin, prices will go up. It's not great for Trump, but by a 5-point net margin, they say prices will go down. So on immigration and other issues, Harris has taken margins on these issues where Biden was losing by literally 20 to 35%, saying on the immigration and border, Trump is better. And she has really shifted the race where she's competitive on these issues. She's down by like 4 to 9 points. That's a sea change, but she's still down on these very important issues. I think some other under-recognized things. Under-recognized things is as structural as what's party identification in this country. In 2016, party identification was 7-point Democrat margin, if you include leaners, Mike. In 2020, it was a 6-point margin. And in our NBC data, we have Republicans up 1. Pew Research Center, which is sort of one of the blue chips for what we all use, says party ID is tied. Gallup says Republican ID is now Republican. It's shifted slightly with Harris in the race, given some of these groups. But we're still running now at essential parity in terms of partisanship. And Trump won where he was down 7 on party, lost narrowly at 6. We're now tied. And the other thing that's happened, I think the race is sort of a Pennsylvania race. In Pennsylvania in 2016, the Democrats had a 10-point registration advantage over Republicans. In 2020, it was about 7.5%. Now it's 4.8%. So in 8 years, the Republicans have shifted, and the registration margin is half of the Democratic advantage it used to be. And that's happened in North Carolina, in Nevada. Republicans from now versus January, they've narrowed the Democrat registration advantage. In Arizona, Republicans have added a little bit. So, and then on top of all this, the other advantage, and I think the other thing that will happen is, I think the vice president's had an incredibly successful 5 or 6 weeks. Credit to her and her campaign. We can get to grumble about the mainstream media and all that stuff, but it's happened. And I think we're in a place now where the candidate has to win the race. I think September 10th is incredibly consequential. And candidates matter. But the other thing that I think we're all expecting, this very narrow race. I will just say there's a bell curve of life. And in the bell curve of life, I felt like Trump was going to win much bigger than people imagined against Biden. And I still think that this race could be surprising, at least the Electoral College level. Because in sweep elections in America, we have sweep elections, but by very narrow margins. And it could be bigger than you think for Kamala Harris, possibly, and it could be bigger than you think for Donald Trump. And I think on the bell curve of life, that's still a possibility. But I sort of think the pivot is Pennsylvania. And again, I think there's some structural forces that could make that difficult for the vice president. And we all live here. We all live in this national media bubble. I think the race is more competitive than people imagine outside of that media bubble. And then the last thing, I had the good wisdom in 2020 to say I was humble. In 2024, I've added a fourth humble. Humble. Polling has not been terrific at what Mike has described, which is we have marginal voters. They can be white downscale, or they can be Black Americans. And polling is not terrific at trying to figure out how to reach these people, how to contact these people, and how to know who's going to vote. And when we're talking about the kind of margins you're talking about, anybody who sits here and wants to tell you what's going to happen is operating at a pay grade way above mine. And I want to just end with that. I still think that Trump is in a little bit better people than imagined, because this last little thing, which is Trump lost Hillary Clinton by 2.2 points. He won those swing states by 1.6, so that's about 3.6 points, whatever. He lost Biden by 4.5. He lost the swing states by 0.8. That's about 3.5 points. And so there had been an argument during Biden that Trump was performing so much better in the polling in California and New York and these core blue states that ratio didn't work. But the other thing the vice president has done is she snapped back to the Democratic base. And so in these blue places, we're seeing these traditional Democratic margins. And so I still believe, things can happen twice, doesn't mean it's going to happen again. But I still think that Trump is going to overperform the national margin in these swing states by 2 to 4 points. And so if I were the vice president and I was a point or two ahead nationally, I'd be very, very shaky in terms of what we've been seeing in terms of the composition of the electorate and Trump's ability to run ahead of the national margin. Last thing to remember, President Biden won New York by 2 million votes. He won California by 5 million votes. And so when people talk about, oh my God, he won by 7 million votes, Trump won everything else by 38,000 votes. And so we need to remember we have essentially 2 elections. We have a California, New York election, and we have everywhere else. And you can't look at the national margins and then think that that national margin has much bearing on what happens in the Electoral College. So that's sort of an overview of what I kind of see as some of the structural forces that are at play in this election.
John, before you tell us the truths of your deep research, I do want to ask Bill one question. Election Watch has been around a long time, but I don't think we were here for 1892. When we talk about the structure of what structural things we have, a rematch, having a candidate who had been president before must screw up. I assume that if the Republicans had nominated a generic Republican, that given those numbers that you're talking about, the Democrats would be sunk, right? But because it's Trump, the structural things work against him too.
Maybe, but I always say in a primary, typically, especially a long primary, the strongest candidate wins. The Republican Party wanted to nominate Donald Trump. And then I know it's frustrating for Democrats, but when you ask people, was Trump successful presidency or a failed presidency? That's like split even. And when you say, did he, who accomplished more, Trump or Biden? It's Trump. Whatever, again, and Mike said it well, whatever the feelings in the room about what emotions to use, I'm just doing my job. Those are the numbers that in retrospect, as people remember the Trump era, it's at break even. You mentioned I'm a McCain guy. McCain lost to Bush in 2000, and then it's like July of 2000, and there's polling that Bush is like tied or behind, and McCain would be 6 points out of Gore. And people would call me and say, wasn't McCain obviously the stronger candidate? I said, oh, for God's sakes. They've run $150 million in negative media against Bush. Of course it's tied. If John McCain had been the nominee, there'd been $150 million in negative against McCain and the race would be tied. I mean, no one loves John McCain more than me, but I can't, this is baloney. The race would have been tied because either candidate we would have had 5 straight months of John McCain's negatives, which, any candidate. And so you can't compare the reality of the men and women who are kind of under the gun and under this sort of assault versus the ideal candidate. And so, that's just my way of saying, look, theoretically, if you stick some other Republican in a ballot, sure, it'd be better. But that Republican would have been under this sort of assault with, by the way, the Democrats having a ton more money and much stronger organization. So he or she, our nominee, would have been, guess what, in a tied race against the vice president.
So Trump is Grover Cleveland, that's what you're saying. I'll come back to that. We'll have more follow-up. I do want to talk about demographics. I have a few things I'm going to cover very quickly. One, the governor's races, because there aren't very many that are very interesting. We actually do have a few primaries next week, some very late primaries for our current era where we've moved a lot of them back into earlier in the year. One of them is in New Hampshire, where we have an open governor's race that will be competitive. On the Republican side, it looks like Kelly Ayotte, former senator, who's more well-known, is probably the favorite to win the Republican primary. And on the Democratic side, Manchester Mayor Joyce Craig is probably ahead a little bit in the polls, but that could be a competitive race. We don't know even who the candidates are. The other one is in North Carolina, where there is both the Attorney General Josh Stein and the Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson are running against each other. I think broadly speaking, some have worried that Mark Robinson is maybe too conservative, too socially conservative, has some issues, and his polling is tended to run behind Donald Trump. So again, we don't know how North Carolina is going to go as a presidential state. That may pull Mark Robinson closer to the line, but he is definitely running behind Donald Trump in terms of polling at the governor's level. The House, I am going to almost punt here because we've talked about the House before, and I feel like the next time we come for Election Watch, we can talk about the House with much more polling at the individual race level. But broadly speaking, I think we could expect the House to be close. There are several advantages on both sides. I guess I would expect the House might follow the presidency. It would be a simple thing to think that a win by Harris is a Democratic House and a win by Trump is a Republican House. And with Democrats having big pickup opportunities in New York and California, and interestingly, Republicans with their pickup opportunities for competitive seats being in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan. The only interesting thing I'd say about that is, in a way, what Bill was saying, we might have two different elections. If we have an election where there's strong performance in these uncompetitive states of New York and California, that could have a real effect on the House, but maybe not on the presidency, whereas the Republicans, many of their seats or possible pickups are sitting in competitive presidential states. A few words about electoral math. Electoral college math. I'm gonna fill in the other states that Chris didn't mention, but I'm also gonna point out a few areas, since I do some work on the Electoral College, where you might have a tie. Again, I think the tie is always this idea out there that people are talking about. It's still unlikely to happen, but there are 7 states, as we know. Those 7 states are all, I think I'd have a harder time ranking those 7 states than I might have a month ago. So they're all pretty competitive, and if they fell, like many were talking about before the change to Harris, that the blue wall states all went for the Democrats, and the southern belt states all went for Republicans. And then there's one other change which I'm going to put in there, is that we have a couple states that have split their electoral votes, and one is Nebraska. That's not quite as close as these states, but it's 5.5 points or so. And if Democrats lost that, you'd have a tie. So blue wall for Democrats, losing Nebraska, southern, that's a tie. The couple of other tie scenarios, a few of them, basically it involves if Trump won Michigan, Pennsylvania, and one of either Georgia, North Carolina, or the combination of of Wisconsin and Nevada, you would have a tie. So there are tie scenarios out there that are reasonable. And as many of you know, when you go to it, if you had a tie, which we really do not want to see, I think we don't want to see this electoral college machinery, but we would go to the House of Representatives voting in this very strange way by delegation. It looks very likely that Republicans will have that majority of delegations that they would need, but that is something that would come after January 6th, something we haven't seen since 1824, but I want to put it in your minds that there are possible tie scenarios. I will skip over the paths to victory. I think are sort of similar, right? There are many of them for both candidates, but a lot of them involve Pennsylvania. I think we've talked about that. That's, of course, the largest of the 7 states. Georgia and North Carolina are the second largest, with Michigan just one elector behind it. And so small number of state wins for both candidates. For Trump, the path to victory of 3 of those states is Pennsylvania, Georgia, and North Carolina. That gets him over the top. For Harris, really Pennsylvania and just 2 of either Michigan, Georgia, and North Carolina get you over the top. And then there are many more scenarios if you wanted to expand beyond just winning 3 of those 7 states. On the blue wall, the blue wall, I actually feel like this for all 7 states, but I think the blue wall states are, there's the polling on it, which I'll talk about, and then there's a sort of past performance and underlying demographics. And I do have some feelings about what I think are the most competitive, and I think Pennsylvania, partly because it's the biggest, and I think perhaps because it is the most competitive, is number 1 on my list. But I will note that, of course, Wisconsin has been the closest, has been the most Republican of those states in the last 2 elections. The polling is actually the opposite of that today. The polling shows it to be more likely to move in the Democratic camp of the 3 states. Michigan, of course, has been the most Democratic of those states in all those elections, the last 2 elections. And the demographics really, I think, are more like the underlying conditions in the past results rather than the current polling, and that Michigan is by far the most African American. It's pretty urban, and they all have somewhat lower college educated votes, but it's not the lowest of all. Wisconsin, of course, is the lowest African American turnout, has the highest rural population, the smallest urban population. There are a lot of reasons. Demographically, you would think, well, Wisconsin might be the state that is the most possible for a Republican to win, and yet the polls seem to show the opposite. So that doesn't tell us absolutely anything. I still would watch Pennsylvania as the most watched state, but I think these 7 states, it's not impossible to really think of a lot of combinations of these 7 states being in play, more so than when we were talking about this when Joe Biden was president but was the presidential nominee before the debate, where we thought we had a much better sense of the two of those two different scenarios. And I'm going to use that as a segue into asking a question about demographics. And I think here, 2 things. One, we used to talk about the southern states, those southern states as being more favorable to Trump, and partly that had to do with some shifting we saw in African American votes and Hispanic votes, and a lot of that has kind of dried up when Harris has come back. So do you think, A, that Harris is just a much better fit and brings back a lot of those Democratic voters who might have been lost under the old Biden scenario? And then 2, what do you think about the thought of Republicans doing better among the working class of Hispanics and African Americans, and how much should we expect to see? Is there still some of that? Should we expect to see less than we did? And I guess I'd like to think about all 3 of you. So, do you want to start, Mike?
Yeah, I'm known too well. I think that thinking about our politics in terms of demographics is very misleading, right? Our country is 330 million people. People have lots of different identities. Throwing out demographics are just kind of heuristics that work maybe at the national level. But it probably would surprise everybody here to know that Joe Biden did better with white non-college voters in blue states than he did with college voters in red states. Right? That if you actually applied the national numbers for race, ethnicity, and education to each state's actual voters, Democrats win the South and Republicans win the North. That's how faulty an explanation of looking at national demographics to give you an insight into what's going to happen in particular states is going to be. And that's because, like, every one of us, even living in this bubble, are not our educational attainment. We're not just our race and ethnicity, right? And you would be insulted if someone thought that they knew who you were, what you believed and thought by only knowing that you were white college, right? That's not the way the actual world works. Right? These elections happen in places. National polling would be great if our system of government was a national constituent assembly and you had to win, and white non-college voters had a certain number of seats and blacks had a certain number of seats. But because that's what this national polling kind of means if you project it out. Right, but we're one of the most federalist societies in the world, and there is such a sort of path dependency in each of the states that grows out of the founding of this country, right? There are academic studies that show that even to this day, not as significant as it once was, but the percentage of people enslaved in southern states still loads in regressions on Democrat-Republican votes in those states, right?
Mike, I missed that point. Could you say it again?
Right, that if you take the percentage of people enslaved on the eve of the Civil War and put it into a regression to do a national regression on voting of white voters, right? It's less and less for sure, but it's still like a decent p-value on that as a factor. And it shouldn't surprise us, right? Because we aren't the sort of the fiction of people who like wake up every morning as if it's Groundhog Day, right? And get a new, like, well, what do I think of Democrats and Republicans today? What do I think of Harris and Trump today? Oh, the next poll will ask me, right? That's not the world, right? You have one half of the country that people still go to church every Sunday in evangelical churches, and more have that religious identity associated with voting for Republicans. You have all sorts of similar kinds of things going on throughout the country that have way more impact on how any one individual is going to vote in any place than, oh, they're white non-college or whatever. And that's why I began what I said at the beginning, that the future looked so red after November 2016, because as we just heard, you almost don't get any place more white non-college than Wisconsin, right? And yet, like, Democrats keep winning, not by much. And it's not that those correlates mean nothing, but that there's just so much more going on, right? And you can't, and you just, it's good sort of barstool conversation about what's going on in the country. But as someone, and want to sort of differentiate myself from like being the Democrat up here, is because I've never actually like worked for Democrats. I'm in the labor movement, and my perspective is a little different. But I've run lots of other kinds of campaigns. That's not how you think if you're a campaign manager. You don't think at the beginning, well, I need to get so many white non-college, I need to get so many black. I just need to find all the people who want me to be president, who agree with me on all of the things, and I don't lose points if I'm drawing them from white college, and I don't gain them if I'm drawing them from white non-college. It's this really misleading filter that's put on our politics.
I want to go back to something Bill said that fascinated me, and I want Amy, you to tell us. Donald Trump would lose an election about Donald Trump. Kamala Harris right now is ahead in an election, but it seems to be about Kamala Harris, right? The consensus among Joe Biden, the national media, and Donald Trump was that Donald Trump was the appropriate object of every story to be written about the 2024 election. And Trump, no one has been better in history about seizing the narrative than Donald Trump. But we've been talking about another politician for weeks now, which is something that I can't recall, right? It's in the Trump era, a time when another figure has dominated the discussion, dominated the discourse. Bill points out Donald Trump gets passing marks on his presidency, right? The things that Michael says are true about what voters think about January 6th and what voters think about all that other stuff. But how do you see Trump in this race that has become about someone other than Trump?
Well, let's start with this, which is if you look at, again, we'll just go back to the polling question for a minute. Even when Biden was in the race and to where we are now, or from when Biden was in the race to where we are now, all the shift in the polling has gone one direction, and that's to Harris. Trump's number hasn't moved. Look at the number in 2016, the percent of the vote, not just the, let's not talk about the popular vote, but in those key battleground states. He's at 47, he's at 48, he's at 48.88, right? Now look at the polling in those states. He's looking better today in polling than he did at this point in 2020, in terms of the polling, like where we were in September of 2020, in the polls in those key states and where we are now. Trump looks a lot better. He doesn't look any different than where we were in 2020. And to me, that's the fundamental question, has been the fundamental question for Donald Trump since 2016. It was clear in 2020, and it's less clear right now. Can he expand his base beyond the people who have already supported him before? The ceiling and the ceiling question. Now, what we also know is that when the race is about something other than Donald Trump, who Donald Trump is, that benefits him. When the race is about Joe Biden isn't a really old person and may not make it another 4 years, really good for Donald Trump. For the last, I would say, 2 years, where voters were focused, when you ask these questions about how do you feel about Donald Trump, I think what was really helpful for Trump was because we were focused so much on Biden, and then specifically about Biden's shortcomings, was that people were now viewing Trump less through the lens of his personal issues and more through the lens of his presidency. So if you look through the lens of his presidency, were you better off? Okay, yeah, I had more money in my pocket, inflation was lower, the border was more secure, the world didn't look so chaotic. So I do think he absolutely benefited from that. When Harris got in the race, yes, the focus turned not just to Harris, but what it took off the table was the consistent smashing of how terrible Biden is. And so then you go to, well, what's the new thing in this race? Right? You had 70% of the public that said, I hate the fact that we have to have this election. I don't like my choices. You said, Democrats said, okay, fine, here's a new choice for you. Oh, but I still have that other choice. He's not different. And so I think that's so much of what has shifted, is that what worked to redirect the conversation away from Trump was as much about Biden as anything else. His challenge now going forward is to connect Kamala Harris to Biden in a way that she's not right now, which seems odd. She's a sitting vice president. And everybody knows that. It's not like she came out of nowhere, but she is not associated in the same way. The other challenge is that what Trump wants to talk about is that she's not smart, is that it's not fair. It's that she's, what did he say about her the other day? That we've had all of the comments that he puts up on social media. That's the conversation he wants to have. The conversation that he should be having, if he wants to win, is she is more of the same. She is not different. If you like high inflation, that's what you're going to get with Kamala Harris, because she is just going to be a continuation of Biden. Now, that's why the September debate is going to be, I think, so critical. What is going to come out of this experience? Are people going to walk away from that saying, oh, okay, I get it. Harris isn't really anything new. She just looks different, but she's going to be the same policy. Or are they going to walk away saying, oh, right, that's the stuff I didn't really like about when we had Trump as president. And
if your own campaign wants to mute your microphone,
Yeah.
this is a sign that
Yeah.
they may be concerned
Yeah.
about how you'll perform. Bill, I wonder how Republicans ought best to message this around burdening Kamala Harris with what has been, right? She has been unburdened. She is unburdened. Is it that she's a San Francisco liberal? Is it that she is tied to the failed policies of Joe Biden? What's the thing that gets voters hackles up?
And actually, can I follow up? Because this question, especially if she's the San Francisco liberal, that's one answer. But if she's the vice president, as Amy was hinting at, right? Do we have evidence in the past that the president and his standing matters? When John McCain ran, he was burdened by George Bush, not by who he was. And so, is there a way in which Kamala Harris can sort of defy this law of being somehow connected to the incumbent of her own party?
Well, if you let her get away with it. Well, and of course, it's the thing. We have an American snap election. She didn't go through a month after month Democratic primary where she would have been defined as the incumbent that we need to move on from, even our own party. So that would have happened in the Democratic Party. It didn't happen. So on balance, I think from, again, as someone who's done a lot of campaigns, it's a very simple campaign. By the way, she didn't parachute into this race. She's the incumbent vice president of the United States of America in a failed administration. What did they fail at? They failed at leaving Afghanistan. We watched, well, I won't get in, we're not here for politics, but she failed at Afghanistan. She failed at the border. She failed to another job she had. We don't have anybody that has more wireless in rural America. And we, for gosh sake, you can't afford it. Your groceries are going up 20% in 3 years. She did all of that. She had her fingerprints in all of it. And if you want more of that, vote for her. If you don't want any more of that, here's the difference. And Trump has standing on all those things to make a contrast. And then, to the extent that she's different, like in Pennsylvania, she's different because we go through in Western Pennsylvania, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, she was against fracking. She said all this stuff 5 years ago for what she really wanted to do. And as I said, ironically, again, good campaigns. The good Democratic campaign is making Trump suffer for 2025, which they fired the guy, shut it down, has nothing to do with him. And so far, she's not suffering for the stuff she said 5 years ago everywhere for what she wanted to do as president. So it doesn't seem to me to be very hard. When I was at the Republican National Committee, we thought about how do you teach strategy? How do you teach people how do you teach strategy? And then we thought about that. We went to the war colleges and thought about who teaches strategy. And then the war colleges, what they said was, like 70% of their grade is they make you predict what your opponent's going to do. And 70% of the grade was how well did you predict your opponent in the war game? But the other part in a political thing is how well can your candidate execute that strategy? And again, I thought former President Trump in the debate with Biden, if you look at his remarks about Afghanistan, the border, inflation, I thought Trump was probably at the best I've ever seen him as a candidate. He offered a reasonable, coherent view of what went wrong, the details, the facts, the figures, and I thought it was a compelling case against the president. And the point is, would he please just do the same thing with the incumbent vice president of the United States of America on September 10th? It's her administration. And she gets to run on the successes they've had, but she's got to be held accountable from a Republican campaign for those failures. And Trump has said all of those things really well. And he did them really well against Biden in that debate. And I hope, as a Republican, that he does all those things very well against the incumbent vice president on September 10th.
We're going to go to your questions shortly. We have room for one more question amongst ourselves. So I want you to, A, get ready for questions, be ready for the mic and identify yourself. And B, if you're online somewhere and want to write in, nate.moore, M-O-O-R-E, @aei.org, or the hashtag Election Watch AEI on Twitter X. So,
Michael, I want you to tell us. In 1996, in October, Bob Dole was campaigning in Houston, Texas. Now, if you're a Republican campaigning in Texas in October, it's probably not going well for you. That's probably one of the first bad signs. But he very famously said to the reporters, "Where is the outrage at Bill Clinton? Where is the outrage at Bill Clinton's many misdeeds and all of this stuff, and Filegate and Travelgate and whatever gates you got?" And people didn't care. They didn't care that much. They were not that outraged. And Dole was telling a media bias story, but it was a story that people said, things are okay, so I'm not that worried about it. Joe Biden was giving a lot of Bob Dole vibes late in his campaign. How can you people vote for this person? How can you people vote for this derelict? Kamala Harris, our colleague at AEI, Ross Douthat, likens her to the Marie Kondo candidate. Strip away whatever does not spark joy. Get rid of whatever else. And we don't hear a lot of democracy talk from her, and we don't hear a lot of emphasis on the coalitional stuff that put Democrats together. We get nods, but we don't get the kind of typical Democratic politics. How do you see Kamala Harris as being different, or maybe she isn't, in what she's doing than Biden?
I'm going to start in a slightly different place, but get to what you're saying, and also pick up on a few things that Bill said that I think are sort of part of really important, how you even begin to think about answering questions about the candidates and their campaigns, right? The kind of structural elements that Bill was talking about, as someone who looks probably to be around entering politics at the same time maybe, held up really well for a long time, right? We lived it through decades where turnout in elections didn't vary much. The candidate, things were very predictable. And that let us sort of confuse what were useful heuristics with the way the world works. Since Trump, the world is just working differently. And to just think, well, this is the way it was, so we'll look at those indicators again and think that's going to do it, confuses heuristics with how the world actually works. And again, this is not being dismissive, right? We played the same game, the same time, used the same rules. I'm just saying, like, we just had 3 elections going into this one, where for the first time since forever, on average, more than half of America voted. That's 2 midterms and a general, right? We have a different electorate. We have more difference between the parties in objective terms, in knowable objective terms, than all those heuristics were built upon, where it was much more about personality. And I think there's a way in which voters, especially in those battleground states, are ahead of the people who write about them, right? In the sense that if you think of the 22 midterm Senate races, right? Where control of the Senate was at stake, McConnell or Schumer, right? You look at Georgia. In the era those heuristics were born, a candidate who said he wanted to be a werewolf, was pro-life but fathered all sorts of kids out of wedlock, was lying all the time, would not come that close to winning the state. But he got lots of votes, not because they thought he would be a better representative of Georgia than Warnock would be.
Or they were pro-werewolf. You don't know
That's true. That's true. And that's one of the other blind spots of polling is they don't ask questions like that. The other side, because I want to be bipartisan here, is Pennsylvania, right? In that other era, you don't get a stroke, not show up and not be able to debate and get elected, or certainly by the margin that Fetterman was elected. Because the voters there knew they weren't voting on issues. They weren't voting on who's like the better personality, right? They understood that the direction of the country was at stake, and they knew which side they were on, right? And so to the question you were asking, in that context, right, it's like that's just like not that important, right? It's like we're in our 5th straight election about this, right? People get it. And the question, and this is what Amy said that was so important, is what is the election going to be about in people's mind? What do they not so much believe about the past, but what they believe their future will look like, right? And so I'm going to use round numbers just so that math's easy, but sort of plus or minus 5 million, right? There are about 175 million people who still on the rolls who have cast a vote in these last 4 elections. 110 of them voted in 22. Historically, 90% of them will show up. That means somewhere between 42 and 67 million of those other almost 70 million, plus another 25 who've been registered, get to decide this election. Though you may have different polling, but among those people who keep voting, they don't switch sides, right? They keep voting the same way. So that first 100 million, we kind of know what's going to happen. And I would argue that the rest of it gets decided by voters who've been in and out. And the dynamic that we should be attentive to right now is whether or not they believe the bad things that will happen to them that the other side's saying will, right? Because if you're not a habitual voter like the 110 million, right, then the most powerful force to get you out is loss aversion, right? In the 21st century, if you're not a habitual voter, you don't think a politician will ever make your life better, right? But you do believe that they can make them worse because it's happened. And look at the group that it is. It's millennials, Gen Z. It's been terrible. So of course, that's their experience. So when you look at sort of questions like, who do you think was better on the economy, or that kind of question, it's a question those people don't go around thinking about, right? They have an answer because you asked them. But the follow-up is, you think if they said Trump's better, the follow-up doesn't mean they will then go out and vote for Trump, that there'll be a behavior they think it was good enough under Trump. There's a difference between this poll question better than and good enough for me to get off the couch and go vote.
John, before you
Yeah.
start giving away the story here, can I just go down the row
sure.
and ask you guys? So I hear a prediction for big turnout, right? You think we're back in the 60% or better range this time? Another
Likely, yeah.
big turnout election, Amy?
Absolutely.
Big numbers? Because the presumption was in a Trump-Biden rematch, we were going back to a more like a 2012 number, that things were going to claw back. You say the number stays high.
Yeah, I don't know if we are at 2020 levels, but we're certainly not back to 2012.
What do you say, Brother McIntyre?
Yeah, because again, enthusiasm is way up on the Democratic side now compared to when Biden was there. And two, there's going to be $2 billion, $3 billion spent. And if you give talented political people hundreds of millions of dollars and tell them to go find those people to get them to vote, they tend to get it right. So the combination of no one knows who's going to win, a re-energized Democratic Party, and that kind of money, all of that leads to a high turnout.
And I'm going to say that we had the highest turnout ever in a presidential election last time, so we'll fall short of that, but I expect we'll probably have the second highest turnout. We will be above prior presidential turnouts, which have been pretty good actually since 2004, pretty much 60% or above, but we'll be high, but not quite that high. So let's go to the people, since we've been talking about the people. And this room, of course, is a representative sample of the national electorate. So you should raise your hand and then take a mic. And why don't we go here? And then if you could identify yourself and make sure you ask a
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti. I am an editorial contributor to the Hill newspaper on technology policy. My question has to do with a hidden factor that wasn't discussed and normally is not discussed, but from ancient Rome through the 1930s, a skill for candidates was recognized, and that is oratorical skills. It was considered important for Abraham Lincoln and many of the dictators of the 1930s. In an era of green screens, targeted attack ads, artificial intelligence, it's not at all clear whether oratorical skills make any difference. But in my memory, we've had two candidates who are first-class orators, John Kennedy and Barack Obama, with Ronald Reagan maybe being a distant second. But the question I have is, do oratorical skills make any difference these days? And if they do, how would you rate the two presidential candidates purely on their oratory? Thank you.
Let me say, my theory of the election is that once you take out the protest vote, less than 2%, you got less than 6% of the electorate that is really up for grabs, that we're really talking about. One question that they're asking themselves not is, who is the Cicero? They're asking, who can I bear listening to for 4 years? Who is the person that I will be the least annoyed by if I have to have this person? Because one of the functions of our broken system and checks and balances and distributions of power, you elect somebody president, you have to hear him every day, over and over and over again. And whatever anybody thinks about Donald Trump, that guy it's hard to look away, right? He is funny, he's crude, he's crass, he's interesting, he's surprising. He's had all of that. And the question I think there is, are people ready are they done with reruns? Do they want the show to be over? Have they had enough of the Trump show? And the challenge for Kamala Harris is that she has a real Marin County wine mom energy about her. And it's rambly, and sometimes it's not clear what she's trying to get at, but it does sound like the way people talk now, right? She does sound the way people increasingly talk. I don't know, do you guys know who talks better?
I'm not going to weigh in on oratorical skills, but I will weigh in on authenticity. And I think that is, in some ways you'd think, well, that's harder than ever to get across because we have such a diffused media environment than it was back when you just had to show up on one channel and you could talk to all of America. But especially for younger voters, they can smell this within 5 seconds. And a candidate who is not authentic. And authentic can be authentically offensive. Authentic can be authentically not smart. But they are that they say they are. And so I think this is where Trump's success has often come from, because if you're right, if you're going to grade on vocabulary, words, and ability to, make a speech in the Coliseum, no, he would not be very highly ranked. But in the ability to get through the BS detector and that's how people square when you say, well, but he says things that aren't true, but you also say he's being authentic. How could that be the case? It's like, well, he's authentically not telling me the truth. So that's who he is. He's not pretending to be one of these politicians who's just gonna straight up tell you things and then never follow through with them.
Okay, why don't we go right here? Oops, well, all right, that's fine, yeah, sure.
Hi, I'm William Arnone with the National Academy of Social Insurance. We're a nonpartisan group that focuses on issues like Social Security, Medicare. What impact do you think older voters, say 60, 65 plus, largely the boomer generation, will have in swing states like Pennsylvania, which I believe has the oldest electorate in the country?
Old people love voting.
My friend Mike sort of big pictured me about my small little demos don't matter. But to your question, we can tell, as just looking at a bunch of polls, we can tell that consistently that what's happened is Harris has picked up 18 and 29, 18 and 34-year-old voters. What is less clear is I read polls every day. There's just a whole range of data. And so the 65 plus vote is just all over the map. The 65 plus vote has been overall very good for Donald Trump, but it's not as clear right now where it's going to land. But I do think, and I mentioned Pennsylvania, the reason I keep mentioning it is because I think it is the hinge of the election, because I think if Trump wins Pennsylvania, and I think he can do that, I think that the rest of the things fall in line and you're over 270. But if Trump does win, it's because the margins the Democrats have picked up, again, with Harris at 18 and 29-year-olds nationally and in key states, are balanced by voters over 65 voting for Trump. And of course, the margins by which voters in that age bracket vote for Trump have a hell of a lot of bearing on whether or not he wins. Because he needs, I don't know, it depends on the state, but by by 5 to 8 points. He has to win these people by 5 to 8 points. And importantly, they have to be a larger part of the electorate than people 18 to 29 years old. And so if they're not, and if he's not winning by that kind of margin, it's very hard to offset the 18 to 29-year-old voters that you've lost by maybe 15 points. Biden, Mike can correct me, I asked maybe the numbers. Biden won them by plus 20. So far, she's doing a lot better, but she's not yet consistently anywhere near that range. And this is one of the reasons I think she's a little shorter than the press imagines right now in terms of her ability to win this election. That's hopefully responsive to your question.
I understand one tiny thing to add, because I don't disagree with any of that. I think that for looking at a group like older voters, or really any like fixed age group, it's easy to lose track that it's not the same group of humans that it was 4, 8, 12 years ago, right? At the older side, like people are aging out, right? I'm headed there. Right, but there's churn inside of these groups, right? And so there's a difference, especially sort of at the edge groups, between individuals in the group changing their partisanship and new people entering and other people leaving. And both dynamics are happening at the same time.
And the folks that come down from the econ department and beat me up if I don't point out one of the consequences of the power of older voters. 60% of people in their 60s vote, 20% of people in their 20s vote, is that we've reached a bipartisan consensus that nobody's going to do anything about Social Security or Medicare until we drive it off the cliff, I'm sorry to say.
Okay, why don't we go, actually, I was going to go here before, so right here in the middle, yes.
Hi, so Yohara from Marvin Incorporation, a Japanese trade and investment company. A number of states are holding ballot initiatives related to reproductive health, reproductive rights. 2 of those are battleground states, Arizona and Nevada. But there's one other state that none of you have mentioned during your presentation, and that is Florida. Is Florida in play, or am I just crazy?
Let me do my party registration thing. In 2016, Florida was 300,000 plus Democrat registration advantage. Now it's 1 million plus Republican. I think it can tighten the margin, but I again, I went to the bell curve of life. I said there could be unexpected results, but that's a net 1.3 million switch in party registration in 8 years. I don't see how Vice President Harris makes up a gap of 1 million people in the registration margin. Same thing about, you mentioned Nevada, where Republicans, they keep pulling never quite happen. Look, Texas maybe someday will change, but we've heard about Texas, and guess what? It votes Republican on a bad day by 3 to 5 points. I don't see how the vice president or their Senate candidate wins Texas. So yeah, it could affect the margin, but I think the state has just shifted so much, and by such a large margin, I don't see how a Democrat presidential candidate could make that up.
Do you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I hope that Democrats don't see mirages there. I mean, it is. I think it's even. I'd add other points on why that's not going to happen.
And just any other state beyond the 7, none of you see any of them as being potentially in play unless this breaks open widely one way or the other?
Well, the vice president's in New Hampshire today, I'm not. Here's a little Wisconsin thing. Wisconsin is same-day voter registration. So when you talk about a nightmare for what I do for a living, and they have Ann Arbor. Not Ann Arbor, sorry, Madison, Wisconsin. So in 2020, there were dorms and college campuses where they had like 140% turnout. And you say, how that's possible? Because every registered kid voted, and then all the other kids went to vote. And so the margins are close, but it's really hard given that composition and that capacity to just show up and vote. Anyway, that's a long story. But on the other hand, Western Wisconsin is part of the Minneapolis media market. And there are other parts where they do. So I've always been a believer when the Trump people talk about Minnesota, you're going to spend all the money there anyway because you're trying to win Wisconsin. If you spend that much money in the Minneapolis and the other markets, what the hell? If in a campaign where you raise $1 billion, just put the chip on the table. He came within 2 or 3 points in 2016. He lost by 7. But as I said, there's just so much money that you have to spend because of Wisconsin. I think when the Trump campaign keeps talking about Minnesota and the press keeps, oh, that's baloney. I don't think they think about where you've already spent the money. You might as well just finish the job.
The abortion referendum will be very consequential in Arizona, maybe in Montana, in a bunch of places. What it may do in Florida is give Democrats an opportunity to coin a term, to veto again, which is where you pour $100 million down a rat hole in a state without consequence because you have a candidate or a vibe that makes Democrats nationally feel good, and Republicans veto too. They find their own vetos in states that are unwinnable, and it feels so good to say, and we're actually going to flip X, and it's finally going to happen, and it outruns their resources.
And actually, to jump Florida, the big thing that the Florida initiative is doing is what it's doing to Trump on abortion. And that is like a big deal.
And it's also a reminder that even in Arizona and Nevada, first of all, I'm not a believer that those are the things that are turning people out when, as we just discussed, the amount of money that's already flowing into those states to get people out to vote, if you have not been contacted or are not interested in voting after all of that, I don't know that you're suddenly going to turn out because of this initiative. That may be a part of your overall conversation.
Well, just let me tell you, young non-college white guys under 30 love to vote for legalization of recreational marijuana.
When has a ballot initiative ever had an impact on the top of the ticket?
Oh, don't you think Ohio 04?
Well, there.
It was 125,000 votes.
Yeah, I mean, Ohio 04, I don't know that George W. Bush wins Ohio in 2004 without the gay marriage referendum on the ballot. I mean, what I see Democrats doing is in a bunch of key places, if we're talking about 10 or 15 or 20,000 votes in these places, how many are motivated and how many are persuaded by having abortion on the ballot? I don't know, but it's not a bad strategy.
Okay, one last question. Why don't we go here in the middle?
Thank you. Gerald Chandler here. Some months ago, there's a lot of talk about Biden worried about the Dearborn, Michigan Arabs. Could you make some comments on that?
Well, I can say that if Joe Biden was the one accepting the Democratic nomination in Chicago, I don't think it would have been as smooth and peaceful as it was for Harris, right? They ended up with 1,500 protesters in bicycles under a bridge, honking air horns and generally having no effect. There were some demonstrations inside the convention hall, but not much. The families of, unfortunately, what we've now learned are one of the slain hostages spoke from the rostrum and were greeted with chants of bring them home. And I think when Democrats were very, very, very nervous about Joe Biden, the, what do they call them, uncommitted? The uncommitted voters in Michigan looked very scary to Democrats, and I think it made them back away from what is generally popular positions vis-a-vis Israel, generally popular positions vis-a-vis all that stuff. And once it was Harris, it was interesting that it's flipped a switch sort of flipped. And Democrats are like, we love Israel. We're great with Israel. We're good with it. And I did not expect to hear the nominee's husband go up and talk about how her brisket brought him into a closer communion with his Jewish faith while he was up there. So I'm curious what you guys think. I always thought that we were kind of in the media tending to overstate the power of those voters and the uncommitted voters. But it seems like the Democrats sort of got over it. What do you think?
Sorry, Mike, go ahead.
Definitely, you go for it.
I've spent my whole career saying that foreign policy matters when American lives are at stake, and I'm very sorry about the American hostage who was killed. But this is not, the Hamas thing has not been filtered as an American story. But in my career, this story about Ukraine and Russia has had consequence on polling in America, which is shocking to me. But the other one that's had the most consequence is October 7th and what's happened in Israel and Gaza. But part of the consequence isn't just the Arab community in Michigan, it's the 18 to 29-year-old voters. Again, one of the shocking differences in our country by age, there's a lot of big differences by age, but is the Israel-Palestine question by age. And so when we asked in NBC, we asked 18 to 29-year-old voters not voting for Biden, who were Democrats, what's the reason? The reasons was he didn't keep his word in student loans and Israel. It's been a major problem for those younger voters about the President Biden. Given how unstable things are in Israel, world events impact the race, and the vice president is going to be in a difficult place given what's happening or what could happen. But so in addition to the Arab vote, Arab American vote in Michigan, the whole cross pressure on the Democratic Party among these younger voters because of Israel is a really interesting story. And I agree that it's been muted since he's out of the race, but it doesn't mean it can't rear its head given how active things are in the discussion of what's happening in Israel right now.
Just to piggyback on that, we didn't see the big demonstrations at the Democratic Convention that we thought we might, but we do have college students coming back to campuses, and it'll be an interesting question to see if that ramps up, because I think that's just not a good story for Democrats, regardless of whether it really affects votes. It's a negative story. It's a dividing the party story. And then on the 18 to 29-year-old question, I mean, I do think we saw in Michigan in the primary people abstaining from the vote, and those tended to be more in the Arab American communities, not the progressive young people. So I think it's probably a smaller percentage of the vote, but a small percentage of the vote might matter. But again, I would watch the college campuses, because I think the college campuses people are going back to school, and we will see what happens in the next few weeks. And with that, we know that Election Watch is not a one-time event. It is a series, so we hope we will see you all on October 30th, the next series. We'd like to thank Bill McInturf, Amy Walter, Michael Porteser, and my co-host, Chris Starwold. Thank you.
Please, big applause for our great panel. These great people, so generous with their time. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.